Welcome to the world of Dreamside Traveler. Here, beneath the soothing sound of gentle rain, we journey through time and space, uncovering the mysteries of the past and diving into the most captivating pages of human history. This place is created for those who love exploring the world in the quiet of evening, for those who value peace while yearning to discover something new before sleep. If you enjoy what you're hearing, please give this video a like. It helps other people find our stories. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers in our club of nighttime history lovers. And the Dreamside Traveler channel will become your faithful guide to sleep. We're constantly adding new stories for your peaceful evenings. And if you have ideas about which historical topics interest you, or simply want to share your thoughts, leave comments below the video. I'm genuinely curious to know what inspires you. Now close your eyes. Feel this gentle rain outside your window. Allow yourself to relax. Our journey begins right now. In ancient Rome, the world of the gladiators was far from being a romanticized image of fierce warriors battling for honor and glory. Behind the blood-soaked arena, the true reality was far darker, rooted in exploitation and violence, not just of men, but of women as well. While gladiators themselves were often slaves or prisoners of war, their female counterparts were trapped in a system just as brutal, subjected to sexual exploitation and control. The gladiatorial schools, or ludi, were brutal training grounds where men were turned into weapons, their bodies molded through violence and hardship. Yet, this system wasn't limited to men. Women, too, found themselves ensnared in the cycle of cruelty, although their roles were often less visible in the historical records. Nevertheless, the exploitation of women in these institutions was just as profound, and in some ways more insidious. They were not only used for sexual pleasure, but were often forced into servitude, their lives bound by the whims of the powerful men who ran the schools. The role of women in gladiator schools has long been a subject of speculation, as most of the records from ancient Rome focus on the male gladiators. Yet historical accounts and scattered references provide glimpses into the reality faced by women, who were often kidnapped, sold into slavery, or forced into roles as sex slaves in the service of the gladiatorial business. Women were not seen as warriors in the traditional sense, but they were certainly part of the gladiatorial spectacle in a different, equally degrading manner. One of the most common ways women were involved in the gladiator schools was as gladiatrix, female gladiators who fought in the arena. However, their numbers were limited compared to their male counterparts, and the role of a gladiatrix was often associated with rare exhibitions or unique events designed to shock and thrill the Roman audience. These women were trained to fight, though their training was often less rigorous and more theatrical, designed to entertain rather than to provide genuine competition. The stories of these women are few and far between, as their experiences were overshadowed by the far larger and more publicized male gladiatorial contests. But while some women fought as gladiators, most were forced into other roles, often unseen in the shadows of the arena. sexual exploitation was rampant, and many women were used in various capacities, ranging from entertainers to concubines or sex slaves, used to satisfy the sexual needs of the gladiators, the trainers, and even the wealthy patrons who financed the gladiatorial games. These women were often slaves or captives, with no agency over their lives, no rights, and no way to escape their situation. The gladiatorial schools were not just places of training, but also of economic exploitation. The men who ran these institutions treated the gladiators as mere commodities, valuing them for their ability to fight and die for the public's entertainment. Women in this system were similarly commodified, their bodies used to generate profit in any way possible. They were often coerced into relationships with powerful men, forced to serve as sexual objects, or sometimes even auctioned off as part of the gladiatorial business. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist and philosopher, described the kind of environment that bred such exploitation. He wrote about the horrific conditions of gladiatorial life, painting a picture of a world where men were raised for one singular purpose: combat. But in passing, he also alluded to the way women were treated within this system, noting how some female slaves were used to entertain the wealthy and powerful men who attended these games. Though Pliny didn't delve deeply into the specifics of their exploitation, his writings make it clear that women were part of the machinery that kept the gladiatorial system running. There are also reports from Seneca, the philosopher and statesman, who was deeply concerned with the moral decay of Roman society. In his writings, Seneca described the cruelty of the gladiatorial games and the exploitation that occurred behind the scenes, mentioning how the gladiatorial schools were places where not only men but women were degraded for the entertainment of the masses. He pointed out that this exploitation wasn't limited to the violence of the arena. It extended into the lives of those forced into servitude and sexual labor. One of the most chilling examples of this exploitation comes from the tale of Thecla, a woman who, according to some accounts, was captured and forced into the gladiatorial system. Thecla was allegedly sold into the service of the gladiatorial games, forced to entertain Roman elites, and ultimately subjected to the whims of the powerful men in charge. While not much is known about her fate, it is believed that she was used as a concubine for one of the head trainers of a gladiatorial school. Her story, though not widely known, represents the experiences of countless women who were forced into similar roles, their bodies and lives controlled by the brutal economy of gladiatorial combat. The exploitation of women in the gladiator schools also extended to the training grounds. While most records focus on the physical training of male gladiators, some historical references suggest that women were sometimes involved in the daily operations of the schools, either as servants or in some cases as prostitutes, used to entertain the gladiators or trainers. These women were often forced into these roles through coercion, threats, or outright force, unable to escape their circumstances. Another aspect of this exploitation was the fact that women who were captured during war or sold into slavery were often sent to these schools. not for combat, but to be used as a form of psychological control over the gladiators themselves. Women who were kept as concubines or sexual slaves were often kept in close proximity to the gladiators, used as a tool of distraction or comfort, but also as a means of keeping the gladiators in check. These women were often treated as mere property, with no rights of their own, their sole purpose to serve the needs of the men who owned them. The exploitation of women within the gladiatorial system is a dark chapter in Roman history, one that is rarely discussed, but was just as important to the economic and social structure of the games as the gladiators themselves. Though the records on female gladiators and the sexual exploitation of women are sparse, the reality is that women were often subjected to the same violence, control, and exploitation that defined the world of the gladiators. Their lives were ones of subjugation, their bodies used for entertainment, their futures controlled by those who held the power. As we continue to delve deeper into the grim reality of gladiatorial schools, we must turn our attention to the broader social structures that allowed such exploitation to thrive. The gladiatorial games were not just a source of entertainment for the masses. They were deeply entrenched in Roman society's understanding of power, ownership, and control. The women who were forced into these schools were caught in a vicious cycle of subjugation that was inextricably tied to the very fabric of the Roman Empire's economy and social hierarchy. Slavery was the foundation of Roman society. From the highest aristocrats to the lowest plebeians, slaves were an integral part of daily life, performing tasks from domestic service to brutal labor in the mines. In the world of gladiators, women were often captured during wars or raids, their bodies commodified and sold for various purposes. While men were more likely to be trained as gladiators or forced to fight in the arena, women were often relegated to secondary, but no less cruel, roles. Most of these women had little to no control over their futures. They were bound by the whims of those who owned them, and the reality of their lives was defined by the exploitation that was pervasive within the gladiatorial world. Unlike their male counterparts, who had some chance of freedom through victory or survival in the arena, women were rarely able to escape their roles. Freedom, in their case, was almost always a fleeting dream, an illusion that they could never truly reach. Some women were kept as concubines for the gladiators and trainers, while others were forced to serve as entertainers for the wealthy patrons who financed the games. These women were regularly exploited sexually, used to please the men who paid for their performances or for the gladiators who were kept in the schools. They had no say in their treatment, no opportunity to escape, and no recourse for the abuse they suffered. They were treated as objects, as tools that could be used for the entertainment of others. It is important to understand that the economic model of gladiatorial combat was built upon exploitation at every level. Gladiators were essentially property, assets to be trained, fought, and sometimes killed. Their lives were valuable only insofar as they could bring in money or serve as entertainment for the Roman elite. This same system that dehumanized men also treated women as expendable objects, used to satisfy the desires of men who held the power. The gladiatorial system, in a sense, was a microcosm of the broader power dynamics at play within Roman society, where those without power, particularly women and slaves, were commodified and exploited for the gain of those at the top. The brutal sexual exploitation of women in gladiatorial schools was not limited to the basic duties of concubinage or sexual servitude. Some women were used in more sinister ways, forced to participate in rituals or spectacles meant to heighten the intensity of the games. In one example, women might be forced to disrobe and fight alongside male gladiators in a display meant to amplify the cruelty and gore of the spectacle. While these kinds of events were rare, they served as a reminder of the utter powerlessness of women within the gladiatorial system. At the same time, the gladiatrix, the rare female gladiator, often found herself in a double-edged sword. While they were sometimes allowed to fight in the arena and gain a certain degree of fame, the reality was that their role in the games was far more symbolic than substantial. Female gladiators were typically brought into the arena for special occasions, often for the amusement of the Roman elite. These women were often pitted against other women or even animals in staged fights, designed to shock and entertain rather than to provide a true competition. The role of the gladiatrix was limited, and it often came at the expense of personal agency. One of the most famous instances of a female gladiator is that of Achilia, whose story has been partially preserved in the writings of Roman historians. According to accounts, Achilia was a trained gladiatrix who participated in exhibitions where she fought against men and women alike. However, her fame was not due to her skill in combat, but because her fights were used to entertain the masses. As a female gladiator, her role was purely performative, and like many other women in the system, she was used as a tool to bring in profits for those in charge. The life of the gladiatrix was a paradox, offering brief moments of recognition and a false sense of power, but always under the constant threat of exploitation and degradation. While the gladiatrix represented a small fraction of women involved in the gladiatorial world, the vast majority of women were relegated to far more degrading roles. They were used as sexual commodities, kept as servants, or forced to endure the whims of men who controlled their fates. They had no voice in the matter, and their stories have been lost to history, overshadowed by the more prominent tales of male gladiators and their victories in the arena. The silence of these women is a testament to the level of control that the gladiatorial system exerted over their lives. The physical abuse and sexual exploitation were not the only ways in which these women were victimized. The very structure of the gladiatorial schools meant that their lives were entirely controlled by the Lanistae, the owners and trainers of the gladiators. These men had absolute power over the women in their charge, using them for whatever purpose suited their needs. The women were often subjected to harsh conditions, imprisoned in small, windowless rooms, denied the basic comforts of life, and treated as property to be bought and sold. The Roman law at the time provided little protection for these women. as they were often treated as legal property, chattel to be used for the pleasure of their masters. In this system, the rights of women were virtually non-existent, and their suffering was a natural consequence of the broader Roman view that women and slaves existed solely for the benefit of the powerful men who ruled over them. Women in the gladiatorial schools had no recourse, no chance to escape, and no chance to gain their freedom. Despite the immense power imbalance, there were a few women who managed to resist the system. Spartacus' rebellion, the famous uprising led by the gladiator Spartacus, was, for a brief moment, an opportunity for these women to fight back. Although the rebellion was primarily composed of male gladiators, there were reports of women, slaves, and concubines joining the ranks of the fighters. For a short time, these women, who had been subjected to unimaginable cruelty, gained a sense of agency and power as they fought for their freedom. However, this was a brief and fleeting victory. Once the rebellion was crushed, those who survived were either executed or returned to their positions as slaves and property. The women who had fought in the rebellion were not celebrated as heroes. Instead, they were punished just as severely as the men who had defied their masters. The tragic cycle of exploitation and abuse continued, and the voices of these women, like so many others, were silenced by history. As we delve deeper into the exploitation of women within the gladiatorial system, it's important to also recognize the social implications and the broader moral decay that accompanied such practices in Roman society. The degradation of women, their commodification, and their role in the gladiatorial schools were not isolated phenomena. They were part of a much larger system of exploitation and violence that permeated every aspect of Roman life. The gladiatorial games themselves, a spectacle of death and destruction, were closely tied to these systems of control, where those without power, particularly women and slaves, were treated as property to be used, abused, and discarded. The exploitation of women in gladiatorial schools must be understood in the context of Roman views on women and slavery. In Roman society, women, especially those from the lower classes or from conquered peoples, were often viewed as property, with their primary roles being those of wife, mother, and, in some cases, concubine. They had little autonomy, and their lives were typically controlled by their male relatives, whether fathers, husbands, or masters. The idea of female autonomy or individual rights was almost non-existent in Roman law, and this lack of agency made women especially vulnerable to exploitation. One of the most stark aspects of this exploitation in the context of gladiatorial schools was the complete lack of rights afforded to these women. Women who were captured during wars, those who were enslaved, or those born into servitude had no say in their fates. They were at the mercy of the men who controlled them. Whether the Lanistae who ran the gladiatorial schools, the gladiators themselves, or the wealthy Roman elites who attended the games, these women were frequently bought and sold, their value measured only by their usefulness, either for sexual pleasure, entertainment, or the perpetuation of the gladiatorial system. A particularly devastating part of this reality was the fact that women who were used in gladiatorial schools were often isolated from society. They were kept behind the scenes, out of sight of the public eye, relegated to dark corners of the gladiatorial institutions. These women were rarely celebrated or remembered. Their stories were often lost to history. Unlike male gladiators, who could achieve fame through their victories in the arena, women had no such opportunity. They were largely invisible, their bodies and lives subjected to the whims of those who controlled them. In many ways, the gladiatorial schools were microcosms of Roman society's broader moral and ethical corruption. The gladiatorial games were a reflection of a society that placed the entertainment of the masses above the rights and dignity of individuals. The fact that women were used as sexual objects, or forced to perform for the pleasure of the Roman elite, was a direct result of the hierarchical, patriarchal system that dominated the empire. Women were viewed as less than men, their value tied to their ability to serve and please the powerful men who controlled their lives. There are numerous historical records that provide insight into the lives of women in Roman society, though most of them focus on the experiences of women in higher social classes. However, the experiences of those who lived in the shadows of Roman power, the slaves, the captives, and the women forced into gladiatorial servitude, are largely absent from the historical narrative. These women had no voice, no opportunity to speak out or to fight for their rights, and their suffering was largely ignored or accepted as a natural part of the system. Despite the overwhelming odds against them, there are a few recorded instances of women in gladiatorial schools attempting to escape their situation. Some, like Aelia, who is believed to have been a concubine to one of the head gladiators, managed to run away and live out her life in relative anonymity. Aelia's story is one of rare courage and determination, though it was far from typical. The stories of escape or resistance from women in the gladiatorial system were few and far between, but they still exist, offering a small but significant glimpse into the lives of these forgotten women. The few women who managed to escape the brutal world of the gladiatorial schools often did so through alliances with men, sometimes through the help of other slaves or gladiators, or sometimes through manipulation of the system. But escape was not easy. Punishments for those who tried to flee were severe. Women who were caught attempting to escape were often tortured, branded, or even killed as a deterrent to others. Their lives, like those of their male counterparts, were considered expendable, and their value was determined by how well they served the system. For the vast majority of women, escape was a mere fantasy, an unreachable dream. In some cases, women were used to reinforce the psychological control over the gladiators themselves. The presence of women in the schools, whether as sexual slaves or as companions, was often a tool of manipulation. These women were used to comfort, distract, and in some cases, break the spirits of gladiators, who were often subjected to intense physical and mental abuse. In a world where death was a constant companion, where survival depended on strength and brutality, Women were used as symbols of both desire and despair. The moral decay that permeated the gladiatorial world also extended to the men involved in it. Gladiators, trained to be ruthless and to fight to the death, often found themselves in relationships of exploitation and manipulation. The power dynamics in the gladiatorial schools were harsh, and while some gladiators might have been able to achieve a degree of fame and success, they were still part of the same system that exploited women, treating them as objects to be used for their own amusement and entertainment. The relationship between gladiators and women in the schools was often one of power and coercion. Gladiators were not only forced to fight in the arena for the amusement of others, but they were also subjected to the whims of the trainers and owners. Women, meanwhile, were forced into the same system of exploitation, their bodies used as currency in the gladiatorial trade. The relationship between men and women in the gladiatorial schools was one of stark inequality. Women were never the fighters, never the victors. They were there to serve, to entertain, and to satisfy the desires of those who held the power. The impact of this dehumanization on the women who lived within the gladiatorial world cannot be overstated. These women were denied any sense of self-determination or dignity. Their bodies were treated as commodities, their lives controlled by the men who held power over them. The brutal reality of their lives is reflected in the fact that their stories are barely mentioned in historical records, overshadowed by the male-dominated narrative of gladiators and their victories in the arena. As we move deeper into the heart of gladiatorial life and the exploitation of women within these brutal institutions, it becomes essential to examine the broader social and cultural mechanisms that perpetuated such violence. Roman society, in many ways, normalized these forms of exploitation, turning a blind eye to the systemic abuse that took place in the gladiatorial schools. For the masses, gladiatorial combat was a means of entertainment, but beneath the spectacle, it was a business built on the backs of slaves, both male and female, whose lives were nothing more than commodities to be used and discarded. The Roman Empire, at its height, was a society that thrived on its hierarchical structure. The most powerful individuals were at the top of the pyramid, with slaves and the subjugated classes at the very bottom. Women, particularly those in the gladiatorial schools, were caught in this system of oppression, their bodies treated as little more than tools to generate wealth and satisfy the needs of the men who controlled them. These women were not merely victims of physical violence, but also of a broader systemic and institutionalized form of exploitation that was reinforced by Roman law, culture, and social practices. A key part of understanding this system is recognizing that sexual slavery was not a marginal aspect of the gladiatorial schools. It was central to their function. Women were often forced into sexual servitude to provide for the sexual desires of the gladiators, trainers, and patrons of the games. In some cases, these women were treated as mere possessions, traded, sold, and used for their physical bodies. Unlike their male counterparts, who could potentially rise through the ranks of the gladiatorial system and win their freedom. The women had no such opportunities. Their lives were entirely determined by the needs of the men who owned them. The women who lived in these brutal conditions often found themselves isolated from society, locked away in the gladiatorial school, and cut off from the world outside. Social stigma surrounded these women. They were considered the lowest of the low, forced to serve the whims of powerful men while receiving no recognition or respect. In many cases, they were born into slavery or captured during wars, and their futures were determined by the will of their masters. If they were lucky, they might find a modicum of safety or comfort. But for most, suffering was a constant companion. One of the most unsettling aspects of this exploitation was how these women were used as tools of control within the gladiatorial schools. Women were not only sexual objects, they were often used to manipulate the gladiators themselves. The trainers, or lanistae, understood that by controlling the women, they could keep the gladiators distracted, humiliated, and emotionally vulnerable. The women were often used to break down the spirits of the gladiators, forcing them into submission. If a gladiator was particularly difficult to control, the lanistae might use the women in the schools to manipulate him, using them as a reward or punishment for good or bad behavior. This system of psychological control was a hallmark of the brutality that defined the gladiatorial system. Women were also used as a form of entertainment, though in a vastly different way than the gladiators. While the men fought for glory, women were sometimes put on display, made to perform in front of an audience of wealthy Romans and foreign dignitaries. These performances were designed to titillate the audience, to create a spectacle of both violence and sexuality. The women who participated in these performances were not fighters in the traditional sense. They were there to be seen, to be ogled, to be used. They were forced into these roles by the men who controlled them. And their performances were a reminder of the brutality and cruelty that defined the gladiatorial games. One particularly tragic example of this exploitation comes from the story of Viria, a woman who was reportedly captured during a battle with a rival tribe. According to historical accounts, Viria was sold into slavery and eventually found herself in one of the most notorious gladiatorial schools in Rome. She was forced to serve as a concubine for one of the most powerful lanistae, a man who controlled a vast number of gladiators. Viria's life, like those of many women in the system, was one of endless exploitation. She was forced to serve not only as a sexual slave, but also as a form of psychological leverage, used to control the gladiators under her master's power. Her story, while less well known, is representative of the countless women who suffered in silence. Their pain and degradation hidden from the eyes of the public. While some women did manage to escape or resist their circumstances, these instances were rare. Most women had little recourse when it came to fighting back. They had no voice in the legal system, no way to challenge the men who owned them, and no hope of breaking free from the brutal world of the gladiatorial schools. Escape, when it happened, was usually the result of extreme luck or help from others, often from fellow slaves or gladiators who were sympathetic to their plight. But these moments of resistance were short-lived. The Roman legal system, which was founded on the principles of slavery and inequality, ensured that any attempt at rebellion would be met with swift and brutal punishment. Even after the gladiatorial games began to wane, the system of exploitation continued in a different form. The transition from gladiatorial combat to other forms of entertainment, like chariot races and mock battles, did little to address the underlying issues of human trafficking and sexual exploitation that had been built into the very foundation of Roman entertainment. Women who had been used in gladiatorial schools were often sold off into other forms of servitude, their lives continuing to be defined by the cruelty and exploitation of the system. The story of the gladiatorial games and the exploitation of women is one that has been largely ignored in the historical record. While the stories of the gladiators, the brave men who fought for honor and survival, are well known, the women who lived in the shadows of the arena remain largely forgotten. Their stories are those of suffering, silence, and oppression, their lives forever defined by the men who controlled them. It is only by acknowledging their pain and their exploitation that we can begin to understand the full scope of the brutality of the gladiatorial system. A system built on the suffering of both men and women, but one that has often been romanticized and obscured in the pages of history. As we further explore the exploitation of women within the gladiatorial system, it becomes increasingly clear that these women were not just pawns in a game of power and control, but also victims of a deeply ingrained patriarchal society that perpetuated their abuse. The Roman Empire as a whole viewed women as commodities, useful only for reproduction, pleasure, or service. In the gladiatorial world, where the male gladiators were trained to fight to the death for the entertainment of the public, women were often reduced to mere objects of desire or tools of manipulation. The physical abuse that women endured in the gladiatorial schools was not just about forced labor or sexual exploitation. Many women, particularly those who were captured in war or sold into slavery, were subjected to brutal physical punishment if they failed to meet the demands of their masters. Slaves, regardless of their gender, were often punished harshly if they failed to obey or perform the tasks assigned to them. Women in the gladiatorial schools were no exception. If they were deemed to be rebellious or defiant, they could be subjected to severe beatings, torture, or worse. Their bodies were viewed as tools to be used, and any resistance to that system was met with violence. It is important to note that while men and women in the gladiatorial schools were both slaves, the experiences of women were often distinctly different. Men, as gladiators, could be trained to fight and given the opportunity to rise through the ranks, sometimes even earning their freedom if they proved themselves worthy. Women, however, had no such opportunity. Their lives were almost entirely controlled by the Lanistae, the wealthy men who ran the gladiatorial schools. They were expected to serve their masters' needs, whether those needs were sexual, domestic, or emotional, and to do so without question. In some cases, women were also used as entertainers, not in the traditional sense of a performer, but as objects of entertainment for the elite. Wealthy Romans who attended the gladiatorial games for sport would often host lavish banquets and feasts surrounding the events. During these events, women who had been forced into servitude at the gladiatorial schools were sometimes used as concubines or entertainers, participating in acts designed to amuse or titillate the guests. The women who were used in this way were often treated as property, their bodies available for the amusement of the wealthy. They were forced to endure the physical and emotional trauma of being used by powerful men for their pleasure, with no recourse for escape. One example of this kind of exploitation is recorded in Juvenal's satires, where he writes about the depravity of the Roman elite. He describes the decadent lifestyles of the rich, who attended gladiatorial games, and then used the women associated with them for their own enjoyment. Though Juvenal's tone is mocking, his writings reveal the ugly reality of how women were treated as chattel, their suffering ignored for the sake of entertainment and indulgence. Women were commodified in the same way that the gladiators were. But unlike the men who could earn their freedom through bravery and strength, these women were destined to live and die in servitude. Furthermore, the social stigma attached to these women made it virtually impossible for them to escape their situation. Roman society was deeply stratified, and for a woman to rise above her station was nearly impossible. Slaves, by definition, had no legal rights, and women who were slaves were even further removed from any possibility of autonomy. Women who were captured or sold into the gladiatorial system had few options for escape. They could try to run away, but this was highly dangerous. Runaway slaves were often hunted down and subjected to brutal punishment if caught. If a woman tried to escape from the gladiatorial school, the consequences could be severe. Punishments included whipping, branding, or even death. In many cases, women found some form of resistance through small acts of defiance. Some managed to form alliances with fellow slaves or gladiators, though these relationships were fraught with risks. The bond between a gladiator and a female slave could be complex, sometimes based on genuine affection, but often rooted in shared trauma and mutual dependence. These relationships could provide the woman with a small amount of protection or comfort, but they also served to further entrench her status as a commodity, bought and sold for the satisfaction of those in power. The very nature of the gladiatorial games meant that violence and domination were woven into the fabric of Roman society. The games were a public spectacle of death, where the elite could watch men fight to the death, and women serve as their sexual playthings. The exploitation of women was not incidental to the system. It was a key part of the entertainment. As the gladiators fought and bled in the arena, the women who served the gladiatorial schools were also part of the spectacle. But their suffering took place behind closed doors. They were never given the honor of recognition, nor did they receive any form of dignity for the roles they played. The exploitation of women in the gladiatorial system was deeply rooted in the way that Roman society viewed women's roles. Women were not seen as autonomous individuals with their own rights. They were property to be bought, sold, and used as men saw fit. This systemic abuse was not just a product of the gladiatorial games. It was part of a much larger societal structure that perpetuated the subjugation of women in every facet of Roman life. Women who were captured during wars or born into slavery were often treated as little more than objects of desire or tools for economic gain. They had no agency, no freedom, and no chance to change their circumstances. In the larger context of Roman society, the abuse of women in gladiatorial schools was part of a larger pattern of exploitation. While men were trained to fight and possibly gain their freedom, women were not given that same opportunity. They were never meant to escape. They were meant to stay within the confines of the gladiatorial system, to serve those in power and perpetuate the cycle of violence and exploitation that underpinned Roman entertainment. However, there were rare instances of resilience. In some cases, women resisted their fate in small but significant ways. They managed to find moments of strength and solidarity, supporting each other in the midst of their suffering. But these moments were fleeting, and the vast majority of women in gladiatorial schools lived lives of brutal servitude. Their bodies were objects for others to use, and their stories were largely erased from history, overshadowed by the more prominent tales of male gladiators and their victories in the arena. In the end, the exploitation of women in the gladiatorial system is a tragic and often overlooked aspect of Roman history. The women who were part of this system were not only victims of physical abuse, but also of a larger societal system that saw them as property to be used, discarded, and forgotten. Their lives and their suffering should be remembered as part of the larger story of the gladiators, not just as the victims of an entertainment system, but as real women whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control. The day of the fight always began in the same way. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets of Rome. Inside the ludus, the gladiatorial school, the air was thick with the sounds of clanking metal and the smell of sweat. Each gladiator knew what the day would bring: preparation for the fight that could end his life. But it was not just physical training that shaped the gladiator's existence. It was the psychological pressure, the constant awareness that every fight could be his last. As they gathered in the training halls, the air was filled with an unspoken tension, a sense of anticipation and dread that the gladiators had come to know all too well. This was no ordinary day. This was the day when one would step into the arena where death was the only certainty. The rituals surrounding the preparation for a gladiatorial fight were as much psychological as they were physical. For many gladiators, the idea of facing death in the arena was something that had to be mentally accepted long before the battle began. The lanista, the trainer and owner of the gladiators, had the task of preparing the fighters not only for the physical rigors of combat, but also for the immense psychological toll of the fight. A gladiator who was not mentally prepared for the violence and brutality he was about to face would not last long in the arena. Each gladiator had his own way of coping with the stress of knowing that he could die at any moment. Some sought to embrace the violence, viewing it as a part of their identity, while others struggled with the fear that gnawed at their insides as the fight drew nearer. But for all of them, there were certain rituals that helped them mentally prepare. Rituals that went beyond the mere swinging of swords and shields. The first part of the ritual often took place in the temple of the god Hercules, where gladiators would seek the favor of the gods before stepping into the arena. They would gather in the temple, their bodies painted with oil and their minds filled with fear and hope in equal measure. The priests would chant prayers to invoke the protection of Hercules, the god of strength, and to give the gladiators the courage they needed to face their opponents. This ritual was an important part of their mental preparation. It gave them a sense of purpose and connection to something greater than themselves, something that could make them feel as though they had a fighting chance against the death that awaited them. The gladiators' preparation also included a more personal and intimate ritual. Before stepping into the arena, many would gather in the barracks to dress in their armor, donning their helmets and breastplates. This process was more than just about putting on protective gear. It was about transforming into a warrior. The armor served as a reminder of their role, their purpose, and their identity. For a brief moment, the gladiator was no longer the slave or the prisoner. He was a fighter, a man of honor, someone whose value was defined by his ability to fight and survive. The act of putting on armor was like a mask, a way of embracing the persona of the warrior. For many gladiators, the ritual was about more than just physical readiness. It was about psychological conditioning. They had to mentally prepare themselves to face an opponent in a fight to the death. Some would engage in quiet moments of reflection, mentally running through the moves they had practiced during training. Others would chant battle cries or speak to themselves, as if trying to summon the strength to face what lay ahead. The psychological pressure was immense. Every gladiator knew that his opponent was also prepared to kill, that the fight would be brutal, and that only one would leave the arena alive. One of the most intense moments of psychological preparation was the final blessing before entering the arena. This ritual often took place just outside the gates of the amphitheater, where the gladiators would line up in rows, ready to face their fate. The lanista would offer words of encouragement, telling them to fight with honor, to fight for their survival. Some gladiators would even make a final prayer, asking the gods for mercy or strength, knowing that in the arena there would be no second chances. As the gladiators entered the arena, the reality of the fight began to set in. The crowds were roaring, the heat of the sun beating down on them, and the scent of blood and sweat filled the air. The gladiators would often be forced to face not just one opponent, but several, depending on the nature of the match. The odds were rarely in their favor. There was no honor in these fights, just raw survival. But the most important aspect of this ritual was the mental game that took place before the fight even began. The gladiator had to accept death. In many ways, this acceptance was the hardest part of their preparation. Gladiators were not simply fighting for their lives. They were fighting to entertain, to give the crowd the blood and violence they craved. The mental conditioning that took place before the fight ensured that they would not hesitate in the face of death. The most famous example of a gladiator mentally preparing for a fight is the story of Spartacus. Though most of what we know about him comes from legend, it is said that Spartacus was a man who fully embraced the violence of the arena. He became a symbol of rebellion not just because of his physical strength, but because of his ability to control the mental game. He and his fellow gladiators would often gather before a fight, not to pray or seek the favor of the gods, but to psych themselves up. Spartacus, who would later lead a revolt against Rome, understood that in order to survive, he had to master the psychological aspect of gladiatorial combat. In many ways, the gladiator's life was defined by the constant tension between fear and bravery. They were trained to fight, but more than that, they were trained to embrace the fear of death and turn it into something they could control. The fear would always be there, lurking in the back of their minds. But it was the gladiator's ability to push that fear aside and focus on the fight that often determined their survival. As the fight began, the gladiator's mind would enter a new state, a state of focused aggression. They were no longer thinking about death, no longer thinking about the consequences of their actions. They were simply reacting, acting on instinct, and fighting for survival. The rituals of mental preparation had one purpose: to remove the fear and replace it with the will to survive. As the gladiators stood ready, their bodies coated with oil, their armor shining under the scorching Roman sun, the arena loomed before them, a place where death and survival danced in an eternal struggle. The crowd's roar seemed distant, though it echoed through their minds like a reminder of what awaited them if they faltered. These final moments before the fight were crucial, for in the face of impending death, the gladiators had to summon the strength to face not only their opponent, but their fear. Once inside the arena, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The gladiators were no longer merely men. They were performers, transformed by the rituals and the psychological conditioning they had undergone into warriors fighting for the crowd's favor. The rituals before the battle were not only about physical preparation, but about preparing the mind for the horrors of combat. The moments before the fight started were filled with a sense of anticipation and dread, where every gladiator knew that the battle could turn deadly at any second. The crowd's energy was palpable, and for a moment the gladiators were forced to acknowledge their role in this spectacle. They were the tools of the crowd's entertainment, and though they might have felt fear, anger, or despair, they had no choice but to mask these emotions. This was part of the ritual. To act with confidence, to become what the spectators demanded, fighters ready to die, ready to kill. One of the most telling rituals before the fight was the raising of the sword. As they stood facing each other in the arena, the gladiators would often raise their weapons to the gods. This act was not just a gesture of respect for the gods, but also an acknowledgement of the fatal nature of the contest. It was a symbol of the gladiator's acceptance of his fate, a moment where the mental and physical preparations came together. By raising the sword, the gladiator acknowledged that he was willing to face death, that he had committed to fighting, even though the end could come at any moment. It was the point of no return. Once the sword was raised, the battle would begin, and there would be no turning back. The ritualistic surrender of one's life to the gods was not just about belief. It was also about psychological release. Gladiators needed to let go of their fear and embrace the violence to survive. By giving themselves over to the gods, they allowed themselves to enter the arena with a sense of acceptance, free from the weight of the fear that would otherwise paralyze them. In some ways, it was a form of mental liberation. They no longer had to be burdened by the knowledge that they might die. They could simply be fighters, focused on the task at hand. In many cases, before the fight began, the gladiators would exchange a brief, intense gaze with their opponents. These looks were filled with recognition of shared fate. Both knew that their survival depended on their ability to kill. There was no room for hesitation. This was not just combat. It was a psychological game, one in which they had to project strength and confidence, even if they felt the fear creeping in. As the battle began, the gladiators would engage in the deadly dance that had been shaped by years of preparation. But it was not just the physical skill that would determine the winner. It was the mental resilience that separated the victor from the fallen. A gladiator who could endure the psychological pressure of the fight, who could push past the fear and the pain, was more likely to survive. Every blow, every strike of the sword was an assault not just on the body, but on the mind. The gladiators were constantly under psychological attack as they fought not just to survive, but to preserve their sense of self. To win was to maintain their identity as fighters, to prove that they could endure the unimaginable stress of combat. To lose was to be forgotten, to be nothing more than a corpse in the sands of the arena. The crowd, with their thirst for blood and spectacle, cared little for the individual gladiators. They cared only for the drama of the fight. For the gladiators, however, the battle was everything. In the heat of the combat, the ritual of the fight took on an almost trance-like quality. Gladiators moved through the motions they had trained for, reacting to the strikes of their opponents, each blow calculated and deliberate. But beneath this exterior of controlled aggression was the reality of the stakes. Every move could mean life or death. Some gladiators fought with fury, motivated by the desire for revenge or the hope of freedom. Others fought with cold, calculating precision, knowing that their survival depended on outlasting their opponent, using every skill they had learned in the brutal training of the ludus. There were moments when the combat would pause, either to regroup or to address a wound, but these brief respites only increased the tension. The gladiators knew that the fight was far from over, and with each passing moment, their fear grew, for in the silence of the arena, death waited. It was in these moments that the ritual of mental conditioning came into play, reminding them that they had made a pact with death. They had committed themselves to the arena, to the fight, and there was no turning back. the psychological toll of these battles was immense. Gladiators would often have to suppress any emotional reaction, whether fear, pain, or anger, so that they could focus solely on the fight. To show weakness was to invite death. To show fear was to signal defeat. Many gladiators used mind games during the fight, attempting to manipulate the opponent's emotions, to break their resolve. The ability to psychologically dominate an opponent was just as crucial as physical prowess. A defeated mind often meant a defeated body. One of the most famous instances of mental fortitude in the arena comes from the story of Flamma, a gladiator who fought in over 30 battles and was known for his incredible resilience in the face of death. According to Roman sources, Flamma would often engage in psychological duels with his opponents, not just relying on his swordsmanship, but also using his calm, composed demeanor to unnerve them. His ability to withstand the psychological pressure of the arena made him one of the most respected gladiators of his time. He was even awarded the Rudis, a wooden sword that symbolized freedom, but his decision to continue fighting despite his newfound freedom reflected the intense psychological conditioning that gladiators underwent. Flamma's story serves as a reminder of how deeply the mental aspect of gladiatorial combat shaped the fighters. They were not just warriors, they were survivors, forced to master not only their physical skills, but their mental resilience as well. Their preparation for battle was a journey that went beyond the sword, requiring them to confront their fear of death and transform it into something they could control. For a gladiator, the true battle was often fought long before the clash of weapons began. As the fight raged on, the gladiator's mind was often a whirlwind of thoughts. Pain, fear, adrenaline, and the haunting knowledge that death could be just one misstep away. It was in these moments, when the body was pushed beyond its limits, and the mind threatened to break under the weight of stress, that the gladiator's true resilience would come to the fore. The rituals they had undergone, the prayers, the armor, the transformation into a warrior, were all meant to prepare them for this very moment. A fight where life and death hung in the balance. The experience of battle was not just physical, it was an emotional torrent. A psychological war waged between the gladiator's desire to survive and the overwhelming fear of dying. Some gladiators embraced the fight, using the rituals as a form of mental armor that shielded them from the horrors around them. Others, however, struggled to maintain composure, haunted by the inevitability of death, unable to escape the realization that they might never leave the arena alive. During these critical moments, when the clash of weapons and the roar of the crowd filled the air, the psychological toll on the gladiators was immense. They were not only fighting against their opponents, they were fighting against their own minds, their own fears. The pain they experienced was not just physical. Every blow, every wound, was a reminder that they were at the mercy of fate, and no matter how skilled they were, death could come in an instant. In some ways, the psychological aspect of the fight was more taxing than the physical. Gladiators had to keep their emotions in check, suppressing any fear or hesitation that might lead to mistakes. If they allowed themselves to falter, they could lose everything. And yet there were moments, rare moments, when a gladiator might feel a surge of hope or determination, a feeling that allowed him to push past the pain and the fear, to fight for survival with a clarity and focus that made him almost unstoppable. As the battle continued, gladiators often relied on their instincts, on the years of training that had shaped them into efficient, deadly fighters. They had learned to react without thinking, to block out the pain, and to focus on their opponent's weaknesses. But this was not always enough. Sometimes a gladiator would lose his footing, would make a misstep, or would be caught off guard by a more experienced fighter. These were the moments that could lead to death. And for many gladiators, these moments were the culmination of everything they had learned, physically, mentally, and emotionally. For the gladiators who survived the arena, the experience was often life-changing. They carried the psychological scars of their battles long after the fight was over. In fact, the trauma they experienced could last a lifetime. Some gladiators, even after winning countless battles, were haunted by the thought that the next fight might be their last. Even those who had earned their freedom or had been celebrated by the public were not immune to the emotional toll that their experiences in the arena had left on them. A famous example of this psychological strain comes from the story of Spartacus, the gladiator who led the most famous slave revolt in Roman history. Spartacus had fought in the arena for years before his rebellion, and his understanding of the psychological warfare that took place, there was a key factor in his success. According to historical sources, Spartacus had not only learned to survive in the brutal gladiatorial system, but he had also developed a deep understanding of how to manipulate the psychology of his opponents. His ability to control his own fear and to inspire his fellow gladiators to do the same was a significant factor in his leadership during the Third Servile War, the revolt that threatened the very foundations of Roman power. Spartacus was not alone in his ability to manage the mental strain of gladiatorial life. Some gladiators, particularly the most experienced ones, began to view the arena as a place of opportunity rather than mere survival. They learned how to play the psychological game, to use fear as a weapon against their opponents, to control the narrative of the fight. They understood that in the arena, the battle was not just physical, it was mental. The gladiators who succeeded were those who had mastered both aspects of combat, the physical and the psychological. The role of the audience in this mental preparation cannot be underestimated. The roar of the crowd, the chanting, the betting, it all played a role in shaping the gladiators' experience. The gladiators knew that the crowd's favor was crucial. A gladiator who entertained the crowd, who fought with skill and flair, might earn a reprieve from death or the chance to fight another day. But a gladiator who disappointed the audience, who fought weakly or hesitated, could be sentenced to death. His performance no longer deemed worthy of the people's attention. This pressure was a constant, a reminder that in the arena, it was not just about surviving the fight, it was about surviving the spectacle. For some gladiators, this pressure became unbearable. The mental strain of performing day after day, of fighting for their lives in front of thousands, could cause them to break. These men might refuse to fight, or they might engage in self-destructive behavior, feeling as though there was no hope for their future. The fear of death, of constant pain, and of the emotional exhaustion that came with being forced to kill or be killed weighed heavily on many. But despite the psychological toll, the gladiators continued to fight. Many of them were conditioned to do so, having been trained in the ludus from a young age or after being forced into the gladiatorial system through slavery or captivity. For them, the arena was a way of life, and their mental preparation was as much a part of the training as the physical drills. Over time, this mental conditioning became second nature. The gladiators learned how to control their fear, to transform it into determination and focus. There were, however, some gladiators who never fully adjusted to the psychological demands of the arena. These individuals often met with early deaths, not because of their lack of skill, but because they failed to embrace the mental aspects of combat. They were too afraid, too hesitant, or too emotionally exhausted to fight effectively. Their lack of preparation, both physical and mental, led to their downfall. For a gladiator, the ultimate weapon was not the sword. It was the ability to master one's mind and face death without flinching. The stories of these gladiators, whether they survived or perished, serve as a reminder of the extreme psychological pressure that came with life in the arena. The rituals, the training, and the mental conditioning all played crucial roles in preparing these men to face death on a daily basis. The gladiatorial games were more than just physical contests. They were psychological battles, fought in the minds of the men who entered the arena. As the battle continued, the gladiators remained locked in a deadly dance. Each strike, each move driven by the grim knowledge that only one could survive. The crowd's roar echoed in their ears, a constant reminder of the stakes at hand. But in these final moments, after the initial clash of weapons, something even more significant began to unfold within the gladiator's mind. The mental preparation, the rituals, and the psychological conditioning kicked in, allowing the gladiator to fight with a clarity and focus that transcended the immediate danger. They were not just men fighting for survival. They were performers, actors in a show where the audience had as much power over their fate as the opponent they faced in the arena. At the core of this psychological warfare was a fundamental truth that every gladiator had to accept. The fear of death was an ever-present companion. It could not be ignored, nor could it be fully conquered. But to survive, the gladiators had to learn how to control it, to push it to the back of their minds and turn it into something they could use. A force that could drive them forward, not paralyze them. This was no small feat. For many, the idea of death was the ultimate mental hurdle. But in the gladiatorial world, death was inevitable. Whether it came today or tomorrow, the gladiator knew that his time would come, and so he had to learn to live, fight, and die under the shadow of that constant threat. As the fight progressed, gladiators often found themselves in life-threatening situations, trapped in a corner, disarmed, or wounded. These moments were pivotal, and the mental training they had undergone allowed them to adapt to the circumstances. Some gladiators would be forced to embrace the desperation of their situation, drawing on the will to survive that had been ingrained in them through years of brutal training. The most experienced gladiators had learned to remain calm even in the face of overwhelming odds. They knew that panic or fear would only make them more vulnerable. They had to focus on the fight, not the possibility of death. In contrast, for the younger or less experienced gladiators, the arena could be overwhelming. The sheer intensity of the battle, combined with the psychological strain, could cause even the most skilled fighters to falter. The realization that they might die could become so consuming that it affected their ability to perform. Hesitation, a momentary lapse in focus, could be deadly. A gladiator who hesitated, whether out of fear, indecision, or doubt, was often a gladiator who fell. This was why the mental rituals were so crucial. They prepared the gladiators to fight not only with their bodies, but with their minds. They had to suppress their doubts, their fear, and their hesitation. Some gladiators, particularly those who had faced multiple battles, learned how to read their opponents. Psychological warfare became a critical part of the fight. A seasoned gladiator might use the fear of death as a tool, projecting confidence or even taunting his opponent. By manipulating the opponent's emotions, making them feel doubt, hesitation, or fear, he could gain the upper hand. The gladiators who mastered this mental game often became the most feared fighters in the arena. They were not just skilled with weapons. They were skilled at exploiting the mental vulnerabilities of their adversaries. One of the most famous stories of psychological warfare in the arena is that of Commodus, the Roman emperor who fought as a gladiator in the Colosseum. Commodus was known for his arrogance, and it is said that he often used his power as emperor to manipulate the arena's outcomes. He would fight against opponents who were often disarmed or wounded, ensuring that he appeared victorious. But beyond his physical fights, it was his ability to manipulate the psychological dynamics of the crowd that made him infamous. Commodus was acutely aware of the power of public perception. By giving the audience what they wanted, spectacle, violence, and blood, he could maintain his image as a powerful gladiator, even though his fights were anything but fair. This manipulation of the psychological game helped to solidify his place as a ruler, who was not only physically powerful, but mentally adept at controlling the narrative around his image. The crowd, too, played a crucial role in the mental aspect of the fight. The gladiators knew that their performance was as much for the audience as it was for their survival. A gladiator who pleased the crowd might earn a chance to live, while one who failed to entertain could face a swift and brutal end. In some cases, a defeated gladiator might be spared if the crowd, showing favor, called for his life. In others, the crowd might demand blood, pressing the decision-makers to kill the gladiator regardless of his fight. The crowd's whims became a constant psychological pressure that affected every gladiator's performance. They were not only fighting for their lives, but also for the approval of an audience that had the ultimate say in their fate. This dependence on the crowd's favor meant that many gladiators had to become actors in their own right. They had to learn to play to the crowd, performing acts of bravery, skill, or even theatricality. Some gladiators would use tricks or showy moves to make their combat appear more spectacular, even if it risked their safety. The mental preparation for this performance was intense. They were not just preparing to fight, they were preparing to entertain. In the heat of battle, they had to strike a delicate balance between survival and spectacle, knowing that the way they fought could determine their life or death. The rituals that the gladiators went through before each fight helped them to become something more than just fighters. They became performers, symbols of strength, courage, and the willingness to face death for the entertainment of the masses. The constant awareness of their mortality was not a burden they could ignore. Instead, it became a part of their identity, something they carried with them every time they stepped into the arena. The psychological preparation allowed them to face the fight without flinching, to enter the arena with the determination to survive, even when survival seemed impossible. And then there was the final moment, the decision of the crowd. At the end of the fight, the gladiator's fate was decided by a gesture, the raised thumb of the emperor, or a single shout from the audience. In these final moments, everything that the gladiator had endured, every training session, every prayer, every psychological preparation, came down to this one instant. The crowd's judgment could be swift and unforgiving. A gladiator who had fought valiantly might be spared, his life prolonged for another battle. A gladiator who had disappointed the crowd, however, would face a much more brutal end. As the gates of the arena were opened and the gladiators were led out, there was no certainty. They had performed their roles, they had fought, entertained, and survived for as long as they could. But for the gladiators, there was always one more fight. The fight for survival in a world that had no mercy. As the battle neared its climax, the gladiators continued their deadly dance, pushing their bodies beyond their physical limits. Their minds locked into a brutal rhythm of fight, survival, and the constant awareness that the crowd was watching their every move. The psychological preparation that had begun long before the fight was now put to its ultimate test. Every move, every breath, every strike was calculated not just for survival, but for the survival of the gladiator's self-image in the eyes of the crowd. For many gladiators, the final moments of the fight were a test of their ability to embrace death. While some could fight with a sense of pride or honor, others were simply fighting to avoid being the one who would die in that moment. The rituals they had undergone, the prayers and psychological conditioning, had been designed to prepare them for the inevitable fear that would surface in those final seconds. But no matter how prepared they were, the fight for survival remained a mental game. As the gladiators clashed, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight, they not only had to fight their opponent, but had to manage the constant pressure of the audience's gaze. The noise from the crowd was deafening. The chants of Paulus Verso, the signal for life or death, rang out across the arena, and the gladiator's fate was on the line. The fear of death that had been buried deep within them came rushing to the surface. Some gladiators fought with an almost otherworldly focus, while others became overwhelmed by the sheer psychological weight of their situation. These moments were often the turning point in the fight, when a gladiator's mind could either collapse under the pressure or take control and seize victory. The mental battle, more than the physical, often determined the outcome. Some gladiators, especially the seasoned ones, knew how to psychologically manipulate their opponents. By feigning weakness or hesitation, they could bait their opponents into making a fatal mistake. Others relied on sheer aggression, pressing their opponents into a state of panic and forcing them to make rash decisions. The ability to play the mental game was often what separated the survivors from the victims. In this way, the gladiators were constantly involved in a psychological mind game, not just with their opponents, but with the crowd as well. The gladiatorial fights were not just about bloodshed. They were performances, spectacles in which the gladiators were actors. While the outcome was never certain, the gladiator's performance in the arena played a huge role in determining whether he would live or die. The crowd's favor could be fickle, but if a gladiator could win them over with his courage, his skill, or his spectacle, he might find himself spared, at least for another fight. One such instance of psychological manipulation can be found in the story of Priscus and Verus, two famous gladiators who fought during the reign of Emperor Titus. According to historical accounts, Priscus and Verus were pitted against each other in a famous match. Both men were skilled fighters, but it was their ability to play the psychological game that made their fight legendary. At one point during the battle, Priscus appeared to be fatally wounded. The crowd, sensing that the fight was nearing its end, roared in anticipation. But rather than succumb to his wounds, Priscus quickly regained his composure and, in a final act of defiance, turned the tables on Verus, eventually winning the fight. The crowd erupted in applause, not just for the spectacle of the fight, but for the mental resilience shown by Priscus. His ability to recover, to overcome the fear and pain, demonstrated the strength of mind that was just as important as the strength of the body. But it wasn't always a story of triumph. For many gladiators, the fear and psychological toll of the arena were too much to bear. Some, unable to handle the mental strain of repeated battles, began to break down emotionally. These gladiators often became disillusioned, their resolve shattered by the constant exposure to death. They were not just fighting their opponents, but also battling their own psychological demons, the fear of death, the trauma of violence, and the constant pressure to perform. Some gladiators, in these moments of emotional collapse, would throw down their weapons in a gesture of surrender, signaling to the audience and their opponents that they could no longer continue. This act of surrender, though rare, was seen as a humiliation, and the gladiator's fate was often sealed. A gladiator who refused to fight was seen as weak, and weakness in the arena meant certain death. There was, however, an understanding among the gladiators that victory didn't always mean survival. Some gladiators, particularly those who had been in the arena for years, had learned that the best way to survive was not through sheer strength or skill, but through calm mental focus, by carefully controlling their emotions, by keeping their fear in check and their adrenaline in balance. They could outlast their opponents mentally as well as physically. But for every gladiator who survived through mental strength, there were countless others whose minds broke under the stress. For them, the fight wasn't just a contest of strength and skill. It was a battle against their own mental limits. The gladiatorial games, with their relentless brutality, were an endless cycle of psychological and physical warfare, where survival was a fleeting thing and death was always just around the corner. As the match reached its climax, the final moments were often marked by decisive gestures. The raised thumb of the emperor, the sound of a bell, the roar of the crowd, signals that determined the gladiator's fate. The gladiator who had survived the fight would often be forced to kneel before the emperor or the editor, the official who oversaw the games. This moment, when the gladiator awaited his judgment, was the culmination of all the mental and physical preparation he had undergone. It was a final test of his resilience, the moment when he would either be allowed to live or face the sword of death. The rituals of judgment were not just about the fight. It was about the gladiator's ability to embrace the fear of death and make peace with the reality that in the arena, the line between life and death was razor-thin. Those who could master this mental game, who could face death without flinching, were the ones who earned the respect of the crowd and the favor of the emperor. Those who couldn't would soon find themselves forgotten, their names lost to history. For the gladiators, the battle was not just about surviving the fight. It was about surviving the mental pressure, the psychological strain that came with each new match. Every battle was a new challenge, not just to their bodies, but to their minds. And in the end, it was often the gladiator's ability to control his emotions, to embrace the psychological battle, that determined whether he would leave the arena alive. The life of a gladiator was defined not just by the battles they fought in the arena, but by the intense psychological pressure they experienced every day. The transformation from a man into a weapon, a killing machine in the eyes of the Roman spectators, was a slow, grueling process that required not only physical training, but a profound mental shift. This transformation was not voluntary, nor was it easy. It was a system of conditioning that stripped away any semblance of personal identity, turning gladiators into mere tools of combat, their worth measured only by their ability to kill or die in the arena. From the very first days of their training, gladiators were subjected to a regimen that was both physically and mentally brutal. They were no longer free men. They were slaves or prisoners of war, captured and sold into the gladiatorial schools. In these schools, they were trained to fight, yes, but more importantly, they were conditioned to survive by killing. The psychological toll of this was immense, as every gladiator had to overcome the fundamental human instinct to avoid violence and death. They were taught that their survival depended on their ability to embrace the violence of the arena, to become part of it. The first step in this transformation was the loss of identity. Gladiators were stripped of their previous lives, whether they had been farmers, soldiers, or slaves, and were molded into fighters. Their names were often replaced with titles that reflected their role in combat. and they were trained to see themselves as instruments of death. The brutal training, under the harsh conditions of the ludus, was designed to break them down physically and psychologically. The Lanisti, the trainers and owners of the gladiators, used fear, pain, and repetition to force them into a mindset where they began to view themselves as machines for killing, not as men. But it wasn't just physical violence that these men were subjected to. The mental violence they experienced was just as intense. Gladiators were often forced into situations where they had to fight not only for survival, but for the very sense of who they were. The gladiatorial games were a form of entertainment for the Roman masses, and the gladiators in this system were reduced to mere tools of that entertainment. They were no longer free, and their value was measured only by how well they fought. The gladiators who survived longest, who pleased the crowds, were often those who had been able to adapt to this mental conditioning, to accept their fate as killers in the arena. One of the most famous instances of this transformation comes from the story of Spartacus, the gladiator who would lead the most famous rebellion against Rome. Spartacus had been a soldier before being captured and sold into slavery, and his transformation into a gladiator was marked by the psychological conflict of having to abandon his previous identity. Spartacus' story is not just one of physical strength, it is also one of profound mental resilience. He had to adapt to the gladiatorial world, to the constant threat of death, and to the knowledge that his life no longer belonged to him. It was not just his physical prowess that made Spartacus a legend. It was his ability to overcome the mental conditioning that the gladiatorial system sought to impose on him. While Spartacus rebelled against the system, the vast majority of gladiators found ways to cope with the psychological strain by embracing the violence. Over time, they became desensitized to the horrors they faced in the arena. They learned to block out the fear of death and violence, to push aside their humanity in favor of the cold, ruthless focus that would allow them to survive. Some gladiators were able to create a mental detachment from their actions, viewing their opponents not as human beings, but as obstacles to overcome. They stopped seeing the men they fought as fellow humans and began to view them as mere targets to be destroyed. This mental transformation was critical for survival in the arena. Gladiators who hesitated, who showed any weakness, were often the first to fall. It wasn't enough to be physically strong. A gladiator also had to be able to embrace the role of killer, to shed their previous identity, and fully accept their place in the brutal, violent world of gladiatorial combat. Those who couldn't make this mental shift were quickly weeded out, either killed in the arena or discarded by their trainers as failures. But the psychological pressure didn't stop once the fight began. In the arena, gladiators were constantly under psychological attack. The knowledge that they could die at any moment, that their lives were in the hands of the crowd and the emperor, was a constant source of stress. The arena was not just a physical battlefield. It was also a psychological battlefield, where the gladiators fought not just for survival, but for the approval of the crowd. Gladiators who entertained the audience, who fought with flair and excitement, were often spared death and granted the chance to fight again. But those who did not meet the crowd's expectations, those who were deemed weak or unworthy, faced the wrath of the emperor's judgment. The power of the crowd was immense. It could decide whether a gladiator lived or died with a mere gesture, a raised thumb, a shout for mercy or death. This, too, was a part of the psychological conditioning of the gladiators. They were not only fighting for their lives, but for the approval of the masses. Every fight, every battle was a performance, and the gladiators were both the performers and the objects of scrutiny. For many, the crowd's judgment became a mental game that they had to win in order to survive. The fear of death was not just a fear of physical violence. It was the fear of being rejected by the audience, of not being good enough to survive. One of the most vivid historical examples of the psychological toll gladiators faced can be seen in the accounts of Flamma, a celebrated gladiator who fought in the Colosseum. Flamma was known for his incredible ability to endure multiple wounds and continue fighting. Yet even he could not escape the mental strain of the arena. He was awarded the Rudes, a wooden sword that symbolized freedom, after fighting in 32 matches. Yet despite earning his freedom, Flamma chose to continue fighting, not out of necessity, but because he had come to see the arena as his identity. His decision to continue fighting, despite having the chance to escape, highlights the profound mental conditioning that occurred within the gladiatorial system. It was not just about survival, it was about becoming the fight, becoming the machine of death. The transformation of gladiators into killers was not just a physical change, it was a mental evolution. They went from being human beings with names and identities to becoming instruments of death, with their worth determined by their ability to fight, kill, and entertain. This transformation was a survival mechanism in the brutal world of the gladiatorial games. To survive, a gladiator had to shed his humanity to become a machine, one that could fight and kill without hesitation. Those who could do this survived. Those who couldn't became just another body in the sand. As the gladiators continued to endure their brutal existence in the Ludi, the gladiatorial schools, their minds and bodies underwent further transformations. The process of becoming a killing machine was not instantaneous. It required time, repetition, and constant reinforcement. In the arena, the gladiators were not only performing for the crowd, they were constantly battling psychological barriers. Forced to reconcile the horror of the violence they committed with the survival instincts that kept them alive. Their emotional responses, whether anger, fear, or guilt, had to be suppressed in order to stay alive. The fear of death, the pain of injuries, and the emotional trauma of killing were all things they had to overcome to survive. The psychological toll of gladiatorial combat was immense, and it was not just about the violence they endured during the fights. It was the constant mental conditioning that turned them into creatures of the arena, slaves to the fight, trained to forget their past lives and any sense of humanity. They had to adapt to a world where survival meant accepting death, where each battle was a performance that could mean freedom or death based on how they fought. In fact, Many gladiators found it easier to accept death in the arena than to accept the idea of freedom after their liberation. Once they were freed or retired, some gladiators were so deeply ingrained in the culture of violence that they could not reintegrate into normal society. In one particularly tragic case, Verus, a famous gladiator, was forced to adapt to the psychological game of the arena so successfully that he began to identify himself solely through his identity as a gladiator. When he was granted his freedom, after years of combat, Verus found it nearly impossible to adjust to life outside the arena. His skills as a fighter were no longer of any use in a civilian world. He was left in a psychological limbo, unable to find a purpose beyond fighting. He returned to the arena to fight again, even though he had earned his freedom. This phenomenon was not unique to Verus. Many gladiators struggled with post-combat life. The transition from a life in constant violence to one of freedom often led to psychological distress. This sense of disorientation and loss of identity was rooted in the conditioning that the gladiators had undergone. Over time, many gladiators began to view the arena not just as a place of physical survival, but as their entire identity. Their existence was bound to the arena, and it was the psychological need for meaning and purpose that kept them fighting. In essence, the gladiatorial games became their life. The arena was the only place where they felt they truly belonged, the only place where they were valued for their skills. In addition to the transformation of the gladiators into killers, their role in society also began to shift. Gladiators were no longer just slaves or prisoners of war. They had become celebrities of a sort. They were adored by the public, whose every cheer and roar was a testament to the gladiators' role as living symbols of strength, bravery, and violence. The more successful gladiators, those who entertained the crowds and survived fight after fight, became stars in their own right, sought after by the public and the elite. They were celebrated as heroes, yet the price of this heroism was steep. The adulation of the crowds could easily turn to scorn if the gladiator failed to perform, if they lost a fight, or seemed unwilling to fight with full ferocity. To please the crowds, to maintain their position in the arena, gladiators had to transform themselves into something more than just men. They had to become machines, predictable, effective, and devoid of hesitation or fear. The transformation of gladiators into instruments of death was deeply embedded in their training, but it also reflected the broader cultural attitudes of Roman society. Roman society was built on the principle of dominance over enemies, over slaves, over the conquered. Gladiatorial combat, in many ways, reflected the Roman mindset. The gladiators were slaves, yet they were also icons of Roman virtue, showcasing the strength and martial prowess of the empire. They were expendable in the eyes of the elite, yet their very existence proved the power of Rome, its ability to subjugate and control not just people, but the very nature of life and death itself. But this brutal system of domination also had profound effects on the gladiators' psychological state. Over time, they came to accept their fate and their role in the spectacle. Some even began to embrace the violence and the psychological game that came with it. Mental toughness, the ability to block out the fear, to focus solely on the fight, became a critical part of their survival. Gladiators who couldn't adjust mentally, who couldn't fully embrace their role, often didn't survive. Those who were able to put aside their humanity, to become detached from the suffering and violence around them, were the ones who lived the longest. The process of becoming a killing machine was not just about learning how to fight. It was about learning to dehumanize one's opponents, to view them not as men but as obstacles, to embrace violence as a means of survival. Many gladiators would desensitize themselves to the violence around them. They would shut off their emotions, focusing entirely on the fight. The brutality of the arena required this kind of mental detachment. It wasn't just the body that had to be trained. The mind had to be conditioned to withstand the mental strain of constant battle, to be able to switch off the emotions that came with the realization that they could kill or be killed at any moment. For some, this mental transformation was a form of survival. For others, it was a slow psychological death, a process that eroded their identity and left them as mere shells, machines for killing, devoid of the humanity they had once possessed. The transformation into a killing machine was not just a physical process. It was a psychological trauma that had lasting effects, even for those who survived the arena. But for all the brutality, the gladiators found ways to cope with their fate. Some formed close bonds with their fellow fighters, supporting one another both mentally and physically in the face of constant death. Others turned inward, learning to focus entirely on the fight and nothing else. Each gladiator had his own way of coping with the extreme psychological pressures of the arena. But no one escaped the psychological cost of their transformation into an instrument of violence. As they entered the arena, they did so with a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and determination. Every gladiator knew that this could be his last fight, that he might not leave the arena alive. But this understanding was not always paralyzing. For some, it was the ultimate motivator. The fear of death gave them the focus to fight harder, to embrace the role of killer, to survive another day. The gladiator who could embrace this fear, who could turn it into strength, was the one who would often walk out of the arena alive. As the gladiators fought in the arena, the line between human and weapon became increasingly blurred. Each contest, each fight, was not merely a battle for survival, but a battle for identity, one that was forged in the intense psychological heat of combat. For the gladiators, the arena was no longer a place where they simply fought to live. It had become the place where their very essence was tested, where they were transformed into creatures of violence and skill, built for the spectacle of Roman entertainment. The physical conditioning was only part of the story. The gladiators, after months or even years of brutal training, had learned to hone their bodies into finely tuned machines of destruction. They trained relentlessly, learning how to use swords, shields, tridents, and other weapons to engage in combat. But their true training, the most difficult of all, was the mental conditioning that transformed them from men into killers. The gladiators were trained not only in the mechanics of battle, but in how to manage the intense stress and fear that came with knowing that death might be waiting for them at the end of each fight. The only way to survive was to embrace death, to shed the natural human instinct to avoid violence, and instead to wield it as a tool of survival. One of the most notable examples of this transformation comes from the story of Flamma, a gladiator who fought in the Colosseum. Flamma was remarkable not only for his skill in the arena, but for his ability to detach himself mentally from the violence of the arena. According to the historical accounts, Flamma fought in 32 matches, surviving many of them and eventually earning the rudies, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom. Yet, despite earning his freedom, Flamma chose to continue fighting. His mental conditioning had become so deeply ingrained that he could not break free from the violence of the arena. This was not just a desire for glory or fame, it was a need for the violence. Flamma had, in a sense, become a tool of death. The rituals of the arena, the constant fighting and killing, had become part of his identity. He had been transformed over time into a man who could no longer exist outside the world of combat. Flamma's decision to continue fighting even after being granted freedom was not unusual. Many gladiators who had been in the arena for years found themselves psychologically unable to return to a life outside the violence. The conditioning they underwent, repeated exposure to death, both as victims and perpetrators, had broken down their ability to reintegrate into society. The gladiators were no longer just slaves. They were shaped by the system, mentally and emotionally molded to fit the role of killers. This transformation into a machine for killing was not a one-time event. It was a process that took years, and the toll it took on the gladiator's mind was often irreversible. The gladiators were forced to block out their humanity, to stop seeing their opponents as human beings and instead view them as mere obstacles to be destroyed. They were trained to dehumanize their enemies, to strike first and strike fast. In a sense, the arena was a space where gladiators had to stop being people and start being tools of death. Their emotions were a liability, something to be suppressed. The fear of death, the regret of killing, the moral questions about violence, these were all set aside. The only thing that mattered in the arena was survival. In fact, the greatest gladiators were those who could embrace this transformation, who could discard their personal identities and become instruments of violence. These men were revered in the arena and were sometimes even treated as heroes. The crowds adored them, cheering their every move, watching in awe as they fought with skill and ferocity. The gladiators became celebrities, famous, powerful, and feared, but only as long as they could continue to perform, as long as they could keep the violence going. The moment they failed, the moment they showed any weakness, they became expendable. The crowd would turn against them, and the emperor's decision would be swift: death. The psychological toll of gladiatorial life was not just on the gladiators. It extended to their relationship with violence itself. The longer a gladiator fought, the more he had to deaden himself to the violence around him. For some, the experience of killing became an almost automatic reaction, an instinct honed through years of training. The more they fought, the more they adapted to the brutal rhythm of the arena. For others, the experience of taking another life was deeply traumatizing, but they learned to suppress those feelings. The desensitization to death became a form of survival. The gladiators' transformation into killing machines was not limited to their training or the fights themselves. It seeped into their personal lives as well. The psychological conditioning that allowed them to fight and survive also made it harder for them to form relationships with others outside of the arena. They were no longer the men they had been before. They had become creatures of violence, forged in the brutal, unforgiving world of the gladiatorial games. They had become defined by their ability to kill, to fight, to survive. For many, the transition into this killing mindset was a slow, agonizing process. At first, there were doubts. Many gladiators entered the arena reluctantly, struggling with the violence they were forced to commit. But as time passed, they learned to accept the violence. They learned to accept their role as instruments of entertainment. And with that acceptance came the loss of their own humanity. The gladiators became machines, performers for the crowds, fighters for their survival, and killers by necessity. This transformation was marked by the internal conflict many gladiators experienced. They had to reconcile their humanity with their role as tools of violence. For some, the conflict became overwhelming, and they broke under the pressure. They were unable to cope with the constant killing, with the brutality of the arena, and with the mental strain of living each day, knowing that they might die at any moment. For others, however, this internal conflict faded away, replaced by the cold, emotionless focus of a fighter who had learned to survive by becoming a machine. It's important to note that this transformation was not merely a process of learning to fight. It was a total psychological overhaul. Gladiators didn't just become good fighters, they became mentally and emotionally hardened. They had to, in order to survive. The mental toughness required to endure the gladiatorial life was something that many could not bear. Those who did survive, who did learn to embrace the violence of the arena, were marked forever. They became symbols of Roman power and the empire's ability to bend men to its will. They were living proof that the Romans could take anyone, any man, woman, or slave, and turn them into a killing machine for their entertainment. As the gladiators continued to endure the brutal conditions of the ludus, their minds became increasingly shaped by the world they inhabited. The transformation into killing machines was not just about training to fight. It was about learning how to live with death and how to push aside the moral conflicts that came with taking another man's life. For the gladiators, the arena was a place where their personal identity was constantly in flux. They were no longer simple men. They had been reduced to mere tools, instruments of destruction that served the needs of the crowd and the empire. The psychological toll of gladiatorial life was not always visible on the surface. The gladiators had learned to conceal their emotions, to mask the fear, the guilt, and the trauma that came with each fight. Many became silent warriors, their expressions often vacant or hardened by years of combat. To show any weakness, any sign of fear, was to invite death. The arena demanded perfection, not just in combat, but in emotional resilience. A gladiator who was mentally unprepared would quickly be weeded out, his failure marked by the brutal reality of the arena. This psychological transformation was not a sudden event. It was a gradual process that took time. The mental conditioning that the gladiators underwent from the moment they entered the ludus was designed to strip away their humanity piece by piece. They learned to view the world through the lens of violence and survival, where the only thing that mattered was how well they could kill, and how well they could endure the fear and pain that came with being forced into combat. It wasn't just the constant fear of death that made this transformation so difficult. Gladiators were also isolated, cut off from society, from their past lives, and from any emotional connections that might have made their existence bearable. Many gladiators had been slaves, captured during wars, or forced into servitude. They were often separated from their families, and even if they were freed, they were rarely able to return to their former lives. The psychological isolation was compounded by the fact that the gladiators spent their days in training, preparing for combat, and their nights locked away in dark barracks, with only the company of other gladiators. The emotional toll of this isolation was immense. Many gladiators felt completely disconnected from the world outside the arena. They were not treated as men, they were treated as property. As time went on, this mental isolation became even more pronounced. The gladiators became products, items to be used in the service of the empire and its entertainment needs. They were valued not for their humanity, but for their ability to kill, to fight, and to survive. They had to constantly suppress their emotions and desires, putting aside any thoughts of family or home. They were fighting machines, trained to operate on instinct, to respond to the violent world they inhabited without hesitation. This complete disconnection from their humanity was necessary for survival. But it also left deep psychological scars that many gladiators would carry for the rest of their lives. One particularly harrowing example of this psychological toll can be seen in the life of Crixus, a prominent gladiator who fought alongside Spartacus in the Great Slave Rebellion. Like many gladiators, Crixus was initially a man forced into the life of combat, his skills honed not by choice, but by the brutal conditions of the ludus. Over time, Crixus became a fearsome fighter, known for his strength and ferocity in the arena. Yet, despite his success, there was a sense of detachment in his character. Like many gladiators, Crixus had learned to block out the violence, to embrace the brutality of the arena without being consumed by it. But this mental conditioning also took its toll. Crixus became so accustomed to the violence that he could no longer see his enemies as men, only as obstacles to overcome. This desensitization was part of the process that transformed gladiators into killing machines. For them, each fight was simply another job to be done, another opponent to be vanquished. And yet, even the most hardened gladiators could not fully escape the psychological scars left by years of constant violence. The bond between gladiators, forged through shared experiences of suffering and death, also contributed to this transformation. While many gladiators were solitary figures, others formed close bonds with their fellow fighters. These relationships were born not from friendship, but from mutual survival. Gladiators fought alongside one another, shared food and shelter, and supported each other through the emotional and physical toll of their lives. But even these relationships were often fraught with tension and fear. Gladiators had to constantly be on guard, even against their fellow fighters, because at any moment the need for competition could turn them into rivals, each fighting for the chance to survive another day. In the midst of the violence, there were moments when the gladiators would question their lives. Moments of doubt would arise when a gladiator, perhaps after a particularly brutal battle, would look around and wonder if it was worth it. Some would ask themselves if they could escape the arena, if they could break free from the mental prison that held them captive. But such thoughts were fleeting. To survive, they had to push these doubts aside and focus on the next fight. This was the greatest psychological challenge of all. To keep going despite the overwhelming weight of despair. To continue fighting even when every instinct screamed for them to stop. The gladiatorial life was a world where psychological resilience was just as important as physical strength. Gladiators were trained to suppress their human emotions, to embrace the violence of the arena, and to survive by becoming detached from their own humanity. Those who couldn't make this transformation didn't last long. They were broken, either killed in the arena or discarded by their trainers as failures. Only the gladiators who could fully adapt to the brutal mental conditioning survived. Their bodies hardened, their minds calloused, until they had become true killing machines, indistinguishable from the weapons they wielded. One of the most tragic aspects of this mental transformation was that, for the gladiators who survived the arena, the fight never truly ended. Even if they were granted freedom, the mental scars remained. These men had been shaped by the arena, and they could never escape the shadow of death that loomed over them. Some would return to the arena, drawn back by the need to feel the rush of battle once again. Others would find themselves haunted by the memories of the violence they had committed, unable to reintegrate into society. The gladiators' journey was a cycle of violence, survival, and psychological strain, one that left them scarred for life, regardless of whether they lived or died in the arena. As the gladiators continued to endure their harsh lives in the ludi, the mental transformation they underwent was not only marked by physical survival, but also by the deepening of their connection to violence itself. In many ways, they had no choice but to adapt and embrace the role they were thrust into, becoming part of a brutal system that demanded sacrifice, not just in blood, but in their very identity. Each gladiator, upon stepping into the arena, faced not only the opponent in front of him, but the mental turmoil of having to become the fight, to shed his past self and fully immerse in the blood-soaked reality of the games. The process of detaching from humanity was not just a matter of psychological conditioning. It was also a coping mechanism for survival. The violence in the arena was so intense, so all-consuming, that the only way to survive it was to shut off every part of oneself that might be vulnerable, every emotion that might cause hesitation, every thought that might slow the reflexes. To hesitate was to die, and hesitation was a product of emotion, something that had to be suppressed. Gladiators had to harden their hearts to shut down the part of them that could feel pain for their fallen comrades, for the men they killed, for the violence they participated in. The mental toll this took was enormous. One of the most striking aspects of gladiatorial life was the deep sense of isolation that came with it. Gladiators were isolated not only from the outside world, but often from one another. While they fought side by side, their bonds were often forged in necessity, not friendship. Every gladiator knew that, no matter how close they grew to their fellow fighters, the ultimate battle was always a fight for survival. And it was often a fight that would require them to betray their fellow gladiators in some way. Gladiators were trained to see their companions as competitors, constantly aware that only the strongest would survive. Even in their shared suffering, they were isolated by the knowledge that, in the end, their lives meant only what they could offer to the Roman Empire as entertainment. Gladiators learned to embrace this loneliness, seeing it as another aspect of their survival. They were not meant to form friendships, not meant to have families or relationships that would tie them to the outside world. Their only purpose was to fight. This detachment from society and their own past lives was part of the conditioning process. They were not allowed to be people. They were not meant to think, feel, or question. They were fighters, killers, and entertainers, and their sole focus was the arena, the spectacle, and their own survival. One of the most tragic elements of this transformation was the emotional numbness that resulted from the constant violence. Gladiators who fought in the arena for years would often become emotionally calloused. The killings, once a source of trauma, became a routine. The gladiators learned to shut down their moral compass in order to perform the necessary tasks that would ensure their survival. The more successful they became, the more they were celebrated by the crowds, the more they were forced to live up to the expectations of their role. The violence in the arena was never questioned. It was entertainment, and it was a constant reminder that their lives were not their own. In some instances, gladiators began to accept the idea of death as an inevitability. The mental conditioning was so thorough that death was no longer feared. Instead, it became something that had to be controlled. Some gladiators even began to see death in the arena as a form of release. A release from the suffering of being trapped in a world that required them to kill and fight for their lives. The idea of escape was never a real option for them. There was no going back to a normal life once you had stepped into the arena. The gladiators knew that the only way out was through death, either by dying in the fight or by surviving long enough to earn their freedom. This was the ultimate psychological paradox of the gladiators' existence. The idea that, in order to truly live, they had to embrace the possibility of death. Their lives were constantly on the line, and each battle was a test of whether they could survive mentally as much as physically. The gladiators who thrived in the arena were not necessarily the strongest fighters, but those who could control their minds, who could face the death and violence of the arena without being consumed by fear or doubt. However, even the most mentally resilient gladiators could not escape the psychological toll that the arena took on them. The constant stress, the trauma of killing, the fear of death, and the pressure of performing for the crowd left deep scars. Gladiators who survived the arena and were granted their freedom often found themselves haunted by the violence they had participated in. They struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, unable to shed the psychological armor they had worn in the arena. Some gladiators, like Spartacus, who led the greatest slave revolt in Roman history, found it impossible to return to normal life after being in the arena. Once they had tasted the power of combat, the rush of survival, they could not live without it. They could no longer see the world as it was. They had been transformed in body and mind into something else entirely. And for those who had been in the arena for years, freedom was no longer a prize. It was an uncomfortable, painful reality they could not accept. The psychological impact of gladiatorial life was profound. It was not just about fighting. It was about survival, about becoming something entirely different from who they had been before. For the gladiators, the arena was not just a battlefield. It was a place of mental transformation, where they lost themselves, their identities, and their humanity. They became instruments of violence, and their worth was measured by their ability to kill, to survive, and to entertain. The gladiators' lives were not theirs to live. They belonged to the Roman Empire, to the crowds who demanded their blood and their sacrifice. In this world of psychological torment and physical brutality, they were no longer men. They were tools of war and entertainment, their minds and bodies shaped by the very system that had enslaved them. And yet, despite all the mental conditioning, the trauma, and the dehumanization, some gladiators still managed to hold on to a sense of self, a shred of humanity that allowed them to survive mentally and emotionally. These men became the legends of the arena, remembered for their skill and resilience. But even for them, the cost was steep. The gladiatorial games, with their brutality and spectacle, left deep psychological scars that could never truly be healed.